If you live in an older house, inevitably you're going to have cracks in the walls or cracks in the ceilings. Our house here is about 55, 60 years old, so we experience those types of things. Now this just so happens was a crack in the ceiling that was caused by some water issues up around a chimney. We've already taken care of that, but now we're going to have to fix this drywall. It's really quite easy, and that's what we're going to talk about today on Ask Neighbor Tim. Now you can see that we've got this crack here. Some of the plaster is letting loose. This is actually an old lath and plaster ceiling because of the age, so we've got some challenges regarding that. But you can see that this does extend quite a distance here, and then it continues to go along the ceiling itself. That is where two of our roof lines join up above. So now structurally I'm not overly concerned about that, because this is a 55, 60-year-old house. I really don't have any failure in the foundations or anything going on. So what I'm going to do today is just fix this, because I don't think it's going to move. All right, real quick, full disclosure, you'll see I've got electrical tape and some tissue around my finger here. That's what happens when you're opening up a ladder and you're not paying attention. Pay attention when you open up your ladders. By the way, electrical tape and tissue, a great Band-Aid for when you're out in the shop. Early on, what you have to do is get rid of all that loose plaster. And you're going to see that does go quite a bit back there. What has happened is that water from the ceiling, or from the ceiling issue that we had, that water's gotten behind that plaster and it's caused it to expand. And then between that plaster and then this paint layer, they just start separating. So what you have to do is get rid of all that loose plaster, because you're going to need some good solid plaster to adhere to. Well, you can see I'm making a mess on the floor. I probably should have thrown an old sheet on the floor to make sure I capture that, but that'll just cause me to have to sweep up more when I'm done here now that I forgot that sheet. So you got to think ahead. But anyway, the other thing is make sure you always have safety glasses on. Very important. Keep this stuff out of your eyes. You don't want to have to go to the hospital today. Well, I think I've got most of the loose out of here now. You can see I've exposed quite a bit here, so I'm going to have quite a bit of patching. Another little trick that I do use is if I've got some smaller cracks, I still want to be able to get some plaster in there and just scrape along the crack itself, and that seems to loosen it up good enough to where I can get a good little spot for that putty to adhere. All right, this is a little tight, but I want you to see this. But sometimes there may be movement between some seams and what's going on up in your roof. And so what you want to do is make sure you've got a good solid connection there. You don't want one to be moving independent of the other. So what I've done is I've actually taken 3 drywall screws here and actually fastened those into the stud that goes above the ceiling. And that's going to give that a good solid connection. Hopefully it's going to keep those two seams from moving independently. Now you always want to sweep afterward, and that even means sweeping the ceiling, because I want to get as many of those fines out of there as possible, because once again I want that plaster to be able to adhere to that ceiling so we get a good solid finish. There are a few other tools that I'll need to use here. Now the first is this spatula. Like, I use a drywall spatula here because it's long and thin, does a really nice job of putting a good even coat on the drywall itself. I'll probably need a smaller putty knife like this. There's certain areas that you might need to get into, especially corners and what have you, so I always like to have one of those on hand. And then also, I use a palette, and what this is just an old 1x8. It's a piece of wood. I like to spread the mud on there, and then that gives me some freedom to mix it up and use it well. So I'll put the mud on here, and then I'll use that with my spatula to adhere. Once I'm done with that, I can simply throw this away. Now we're going to start applying mud. I've already put some of the mud up there, but what you want to do is you want to scrape it across the crack like that, and you want to go both ways. Now you've got to go both ways because you want to make sure you get it filled right along where that crack is right there. Because if all I did was go this way, especially like in this crack right here, the edge of the crack that you'll see right here, if I go this way, I'm going to sort of skip over that, and I'll probably have an air gap right there. That's not going to give me good adherence. I've got to get that mud in there at all the various places. All right, as you can see, I've got my first coat on. You want to go with a relatively thin coat. Don't go with a thick coat. Let me tell you a story. I was working on our very first house. It was up north of Fort Wayne, and I was working in the upstairs, and I built out the upstairs. The upstairs came unfinished, and so I had to do all the, the stud work, the electrical, the plumbing, and everything, but I also had to do the drywall work. I was fairly young in my career, and I said to myself, why don't I go with one big thick coat of drywall mud, because then all I have to do is sand it once, I can paint it, save all this time, and I'll be done. Well, let me tell you, by the time I was done sanding, I tell you, that floor looked like a 50-pound bag of flour just exploded in a really badly run bakery. Now I've let it dry for about an hour and it really looks like it's drying pretty nice. So now it's time to start smoothing it out. Now because we're in a house, I'm not going to use sandpaper. A lot of times I'll use sandpaper to smooth out the drywall, and that actually works probably the best. But because I'm inside the house, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to cause all that dust that you're going to get with sandpaper. So I'm going to go ahead and just use a sponge. Now I do have to get that sponge wet. Remember, I've got my ice cream party pail. First thing you get to do is eat the ice cream. Then you use the bucket for all kind of things around the house. But I just grabbed this sponge, and I'm going to use the sponge. I've got it a little bit wet, and I'm going to go ahead and use that sponge to start smoothing it out. While you're putting that drywall on, always try to get my spatula about as flat to the ceiling as possible, because it tends to distribute it really nice and give me a good smooth distribution of that mud. Well, I'm really happy with the way it turned out. Nice and smooth. It took me about 6 coats actually to get it filled in. You'll see a little discoloration here. That's where the plaster filled in, where that hole was that we had from our lath and plaster ceiling. But it turned out really good. I'm happy with it. Don't be scared to try something like this yourself. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments section down below. Anyway, have a great day. This is Tim with Ask Neighbor Tim.